As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
I think some people are coming into work with that I'm a perfect stoic leader face still, and they're not fully kind of embracing the vulnerability side of things. So focusing in on where you can do better, I think, is really crucial. And for the vulnerability piece, we introduce a concept of a struggle statement to make your relationships more meaningful and also to help show your true self to your employees.
There's a lot of really good reasons to be vulnerable and sort of let go of that idea that you have to be perfect to be a leader and instead be a human leader that people actually find inspirational then, because they can connect themselves to you and see themselves in you, which is much more motivating.
That was Patricia Grabarek and Katina Sawyer on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
I'm Yael Schoenbrunn, a clinical psychologist, faculty at Brown University, author of Work, Parent Thrive, and a biweekly newsletter on relationships.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. It's Debbie. Be sure to stick around to the end of the episode to hear my co-host chat with Jill about our conversation today. And don't forget, you can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Enjoy the interview. My two guests today, Patricia Grabarek and Katina Sawyer, are co-founders of Worker Being and co-authors of Leading for Wellness, How to Create a Team Culture Where Everyone Thrives. Patricia is a seasoned industrial and organizational psychologist specializing in workplace wellness, organizational culture, employee engagement, diversity and inclusion, and leadership development. Dr. Grabarek has led people analytics and talent management initiatives for more than 60 organizations across various industries. Her work focuses on research-based strategies to improve well-being, retention, performance, and diversity efforts. She holds a PhD and MS in industrial organizational psychology from Penn State and a BA in psychology from UCLA. Katina is an industrial and organizational psychologist and an associate professor of management and organizations at the University of Arizona's Eller College of Management. A leading expert in work-life balance, leadership, positive workplace behaviors, and diversity, she has published more than 50 peer-reviewed studies, book chapters, and articles in outlets such as Harvard Business Review. She holds a BA in psychology from Villanova University and a dual PhD and MS in industrial and organizational psychology and women's studies from Penn State. Welcome to you both. It's so delightful to have you here today.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
I'll just tell our listeners really quickly that we met each other in person last week because you happen to be here in Denver for an industrial organizational psychology conference. And so I went to your book launch party. It was so fun.
Yeah.
We're so happy to have you there. It was so much fun. So glad we could make it work. And it's awesome to have met you in person.
Thanks. And it was fun to see all your colleagues there celebrating you and the amazing work you're doing. People were really gushing about you too. So it was pretty cool to see that.
That's so nice. Yeah, our friends and colleagues are the best. So you got to meet a lot of really awesome, special people.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, next year I should come to this conference. It's super fun.
Yeah, actually, the Society for Industrial Organizational Psych Conference is a pretty good place to keep up with the research on some of the stuff that we're talking about. And it was mine. I think you're only 1 year behind me, Patricia, but it was my 18th conference.
Yeah,
which is
17 for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's pretty fun when you've been going to the same conference for so long. You know people, and it's, it's just like feels like a reunion. It's so fun.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to dive in and talk about your fabulous new book, Leading for Wellness, which I just love. I think it's such a helpful book. Leaders everywhere should definitely read it because it gives really practical strategies for leading in a way that really is going to enhance the well-being of people and not only that, beyond. And so I want to start with a question that is basically drawn from the title of your very first chapter, which is, why does workplace wellness matter? And I'm especially curious to hear maybe a little glimpse into the research on this in terms of why caring about employee wellness and workplace culture is an important thing for people to be thinking about.
Workplace wellness matters for a variety of reasons. I mean, for one, if you care about people, it's important because we want people to be able to be effective and thrive, right? If you're going into work and you're exhausted, you're starting to burn out, you're not going to be doing well. You're not going to do well at work, but you're also not going to do well at home. It carries over and it's going to have an impact on your physical and mental health, your relationships, and you're just really not going to be able to do well. So I think just from an individual person perspective, there's a lot there. But workplace wellness has a huge impact on performance, on productivity, on retention, right? If you want employees that are going to stay with your organization, they're going to do really great work, they're going to drive profit and increase revenue, those employees have to be doing well. You're not going to see that success in the way that you want it if you don't have healthy employees. Organizations that are very large that have unhealthy employees, they waste a ton of money. Like, maybe they're successful in the sense of like their stocks are great, but what you see is their employees are leaving. Their employees are not as productive as they could be, right? Their performance is subpar for what they can actually do and accomplish. And they're throwing away money, wasting money on not having the right people in place, not having the people in place that can actually get their work done effectively, and not, having to continue to hire because you're burning people out or paying leave or paying for, higher health insurance, all these different things that are really impacting the bottom line. So imagine how much more successful organizations can be if they invest in making healthy environments. So not just throwing away money at problems caused by unhealthy environments.
Also, not only are they losing money from poor people-related practices, but they're also spending money on the wrong stuff when it comes to wellness. So a lot of these same companies have strong wellness or well-being programs or total rewards or whatever the case may be. And they are actively spending large sums of money to try to fix a problem that they're causing. So that's an issue, right? They're creating a problem of overwork and a bad work environment, and then they're trying to spend money to fix that problem. And the way they're spending it is very much like a Band-Aid set of solutions, right? So there's no amount of mindfulness at lunch that can overcome a toxic boss, right? And so that's a misstep that organizations have made, that even when they're trying to solve for these problems, they're caught in a cycle where they're causing it, and then the solutions are not actually a match for the problem itself. And so from the organizational perspective, there's other things that you can be doing, other ways that you can be spending your time and resources to actually get at the root of the problem, which we've uncovered has to do a lot with leaders and their behaviors and supporting wellness. But taking one step back from organizations as well, and something we talk about in the book, one of the reasons that Patricia and I got into industrial organizational psychology is because we really care a lot about society and the impacts that organizations have on society. And, if you think about how much time people spend at work, and I always ask this question in my MBA class of my students, like, when you have a bad day at work, what do you do? And they always say, I go home and I vent to my significant other, or I vent to my friends, or I drink alcohol. Like these are the things that people say they do when they have a bad day. And if you frequently have bad days, you're putting all of this like negativity and you're sucking energy out of people in the community. And so the organizations actually have a net impact on the communities that they sit in and serve, because you can either put people out into the community who have energy to contribute and, coach the soccer team and volunteer and go to the park and do fun stuff. Or you're putting people out who just want to curl up in a ball and watch Netflix and disconnect or disassociate, right? And that has a big impact on the way our communities function. So from a broader level, thinking about the impact that organizations have on society, if that's something that people out there care about, we do care about that. But yeah.
We do too. Here, I'm speaking for the whole podcast here. And I think that's so important, right? It's like, it's about individuals, but it's also about our world and our culture, our society in general being healthier. So yeah, it has really big ramifications, I think, when there are these just sort of toxic, overworking jobs out there, and how unfortunate that is on the big scale.
Yeah, it definitely impacts relationships, people's connections. I mean, it's so vast, the impact it can have.
Yeah, absolutely. When people are depleted and stressed all the time. I think the timing is really interesting for this conversation, because as you may have noticed in the news, I mean, we're recording this in April 2025. And if you follow the news, we've had a lot of economic uncertainty and stress going on in the world. And to me, it's like, well, maybe that means wellness is more important than ever because we're going through all this. But in some ways, I think it's harder than ever because of that. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, are you finding that there's any backlash in talking about this right now? Or is it like, what's the vibe?
I wouldn't say backlash necessarily, but I do think that there's this sense that the idea of thriving seems a little far off for people at times. And so we actually had a really interesting dialogue at PsyOp with somebody who was in a session that I was facilitating. And she said, I would love to say that I could get my team to thrive, but I don't know if we're like at that point. Right now I'm trying to get them to survive, and like thrive seems far away. And one of the things that, I brought up to her was that maybe total thriving is not possible at all points in history or at all points in your company's history or your team's history. But what you can do is find these pockets of moments of thriving that you can integrate even through times that are really challenging, such that the net is much more positive than it would be if you weren't doing that. So sometimes it's these little actions, these little baby steps that you can take to make your day a little bit better, to make people feel a little bit more supported. A couple of things happened when I first joined my department here at University of Arizona. It's not a surprise. The university was like in massive debt and things like that. And so we had to like cut a lot of budgets and things were not going super great. But at every turn, everyone in my department responded with kindness and generosity. And so they kept saying to me, I feel so bad, since you got here, all these things, the university is getting hit with all these things and we're having to make all these cuts and whatever. And I was like, that's true. But I'm not actually paying attention to the bad stuff that's happening as much as I'm paying attention to the way everyone I'm working with is responding. And that to me really meant a lot. And I think that would be our reply to someone who's struggling with this idea of thriving, is like, yeah, maybe that's not a possible goal right now, but what is within your control and how can you respond to it in a way that promotes thriving more than it hinders it?
And you don't have to make the team be the place that's going to create more stress, more anxiety, more issues, right, in the world and chaotic place we're living right now. So I think the team can contribute to, like Katina said, let's balance it out a bit. From my perspective, one thing that we're seeing that's interesting is we're seeing a lot of like mid-level managers and leaders very interested in this topic. But I think there's a little bit of a disconnect with some of the more senior leaders. I think there's some organizations where they do really care and they want to get into it, but there's so much coming at them, right? Like, what do I do now that things might be more expensive because of tariffs? Or what do I do? Right. So there's a lot of stuff happening that this may not always be the priority because they're trying to like keep everything afloat. So trying to help those middle managers that are very hungry for this right now, I think is so important, even as senior leaders that maybe don't have the time to invest in it themselves right now, giving them the space to create those microcultures and almost taking the the cues from their more junior leaders on how they should change their behavior while they're managing kind of the bigger picture stuff, I think could be really valuable right now.
I love that. And I mean, I do think what you're saying about maybe the team or these individual relationships are so important when things are stressful and they're sort of having that pressure though of the economics and then also wanting to support people. And so it's definitely a challenge and so important. I mean, if people can get solidarity with their coworkers, with their leaders, that actually can be really helpful when you're going through uncertainty.
100%.
So you give examples of leader types, and there is a type that is sort of the aspirational one in terms of wellness, and then one that is not so aspirational. You have the generators and the extinguishers. Can you tell us what those are and some of the characteristics of these two types?
Yeah. So generators, why we call them that is because they generate energy on their team. They generate positivity and gratitude and, all the things that you want to see in your specific group and your organization. Generators, these are the leaders that you want to work for, the leader you dream of becoming. They are people that do a really great job of creating genuine connections on their team and really building that culture, right? Helping employees manage their work and life goals, setting boundaries and maintaining boundaries for them. Pretty much everything, if you were to read the book, all the different behaviors that we talk about, those generators embody. They're vulnerable, they're authentic, they're building relationships, they're setting the right tone on their team, they're leading by example and actually taking time to disconnect and take vacations and do what they need to do as well so that people see that that's okay. So generators are really bringing that type of energy to their teams. And extinguishers are kind of the opposite, right? So they are squashing out energy. They're not leading by example. They're overworking themselves. They're overworking the team. They're not spending time getting to know folks and really understand people's individual needs. They're truly extinguishing the energy. Like they're just not helping people focus on wellness. They're kind of making it worse, honestly.
Yeah. And in doing the interviews with the folks that we discuss in the book for our research, it was interesting because our initial focus, and it remained our focus throughout our study, but was really to find the bright spots. Instead of learning what not to do, let's learn proactively what makes a great leader as opposed to just the absence of bad stuff. And inevitably in the interviews, as people were talking about their great leaders, they would say, but can I please just share with you a horror story of a terrible leader that I had as a contrast? And so, we kept trying to pull them back to the bright spots, but what we realized in that process was actually this is a useful foil for people to understand, not just okay, these are the very positive behaviors, but also these are the very negative behaviors. So yes, avoid the extinguisher behaviors, but then also proactively do the generator behaviors. It's not just not being an extinguisher that matters. And so those stories actually ended up being really useful for us in building the book because we had these strong examples of what not to do as well.
The stories are great. They really bring it to life. And also the narratives, because you did this research and you included some verbatim quotes from people. And then you tied it to all these other kind of pockets of research from psychology and organizational psychology and brought it to life. It was like a really fun read.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
We're so glad that you think that. Yeah. The stories are what's really compelling, right? And hearing from people about what their experiences have been. And the thing that I think resonated so much with us as we were interviewing folks and hearing their stories, sometimes these leaders that they had were leaders that they worked for 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But it was so positive. It was such a great experience. And these leaders stood out so much against the milieu of all the other leaders that these folks had that it was really powerful, not just the extent to which it made a difference on their well-being and how much that mattered to them in their life, but also the extent to which this really matters to leaders. Like thinking about the idea that you could be this leader for somebody that 10 years from now, somebody says, hey, have you ever had a leader who was proactively positive in supporting your well-being? And somebody who's willing to spend 90 minutes telling another person about you. From a leadership legacy standpoint, that's also maybe an important motivator for people who want to adopt these behaviors, because that was super clear in our interviews that these people made such a big difference and they were so memorable for such a long time.
And I think that's another thing you're talking about why workplace wellness matters. Like you can leave this kind of legacy, and that person's going to stay with you, right? They're committed, they're loyal, they're going to do everything they can to make the team successful because they care about you too. And they admire you, they want you to be successful. So I think that is a huge benefit for a leader as well, right? Because they now have a team of people that is with them on this journey and they're trying to achieve the same goals and everyone's helping each other out. And it just creates this like collaborative, collegial environment where people can really accomplish a lot when they work together in this type of space.
I loved reading about authenticity, which is one of the big qualities that you describe in the generator types. And every time I read about authentic leadership and the importance of authenticity, it's just such a reminder that we don't have to do anything like extraordinary. We don't have to follow the picture we see of a CEO in a movie from the 80s or something to be a good leader. So can you tell us about your chapter on authenticity and what's so important about that and how can people foster that quality?
Yeah. So authenticity became very central to what people were sharing with us because one of the things that stood out the most about generator leaders is that they broke this traditional mold of what it means to be a leader. And it's an interesting example that you brought up about, someone, a CEO from a movie in the 80s. Like these norms of leadership have actually stuck with us in society for way longer than they should have. And these are called ideal worker norms. And we talk about the research around those in the book. But the idea of the ideal worker norm is that these norms for what it means to lead and to be an ideal employee really came from a time period where the spheres of home and work were quite divided. Couples often only had one person participating in the workforce, usually a male, and then women were more likely to stay home. And so the idea of these employees who are able to just focus all their time and energy on one sphere, right, has stuck, even though that's not what the world looks like anymore. And so this lack of showing your true self and having this work identity and not bringing your personal life into the work sphere and acting like you're always on and always able to contribute. And all of those norms are there in our workplace, but they just don't fit modern reality. So what's happening? People are still carrying out those norms at work, but it's fake. That's not really what their life is. That's not really what they would like their life to be. So as people start to show more authenticity, that allows other people to be more honest about what they have going on because that's just the reality of their lives. And so people really want leaders who reflect them. And that's motivating because then they can see themselves becoming a leader someday. And it also creates these stronger relational bonds between people because you know that the person's showing you their true self.
One of the stories that brought that to life for me was the 7 a.m. phone call that this male boss had put in place when he had a spouse at home with the kids. Can you tell the story to the listeners?
Yeah. So this leader, he had a stay-at-home wife partner that was taking care of the children, and he set a 7 a.m. meeting every single day with his team members to basically come together to start the day off right. And that was an expectation he had for everybody. He kind of didn't, even when people were running late, that him, that was a sign of them not being as committed to the work than anything else. He just kind of he was in this space where 7 a.m., totally reasonable. We got to start, we got to get going, we got to get aligned. Unfortunately, tragedy hit this person's life, and his wife passed away. And so now he was suddenly a single parent and didn't realize all the responsibilities that he had to take care of his children, that he had to get them ready for school, make sure they were fed and showered and clothed and all the things that you need to do that a lot of people have to do in the mornings, right? And a lot of his employees were having to do in the mornings. He was seeing women were turning over at a higher rate in the past. And part of that was because we know childcare tends to fall on women's shoulders more so than the men. So now he's starting to see, what is it like for my employees when they have other priorities? And he actually missed one of the 7 a.m. calls because one of his children was having a hard time with, coping with the grief of the loss of their mother. And it was kind of a big aha moment for him where he realized that this is not a reasonable expectation and was able to start to shift his behavior and the way his team functioned and become more flexible and accommodating to people's individual needs because he now fully understood them.
It's such a great story. And also, in acknowledging that and making that shift, I think he also role modeled something so important to his team as well, which is that, oh, I was wrong and I've learned something and now I have this problem happening, which actually leads really perfectly into our next topic, which is about vulnerability and actually being fallible and showing flaws. So could you talk a little bit about that aspect of leadership as well?
Yeah, part of that ideal worker norm that's been so sticky is this idea that leaders always have to have the answer, that you always have to be able to communicate a direction. And if you make a mistake, you have to be perfect. And if you make a mistake, that's a sign that you're a bad leader. And what we saw in our research was that employees really appreciated when leaders owned their mistakes, talked about their struggles. And it's interesting because everybody makes mistakes. And so if you have a leader who acts like they never make mistakes, it's very challenging for you to be honest about mistakes that you've made. This is a concept around psychological safety, right? So I'm not going to tell my leader that I've made a mistake. So now my leader's operating with bad information, right? There are things going on that the leader's not aware of and problems that can't be addressed because no one wants to bring them up. But also it makes it look bad for the leader because leaders do make mistakes. They do have flaws. They do struggle with things. And so the people around you know that. They know that you're not a perfect person. But the fact that you're seeming like you want to be viewed as a perfect person then makes you seem suspicious, untrustworthy. It breaks down the trust that you have with your team members, because if you're hiding that you have flaws, what else are you hiding? And how can I trust or predict your behavior in a situation if I don't know what your motivation is or what the real you actually thinks and says and does? So there's a lot of really good reasons to be vulnerable and sort of let go of that idea that you have to be perfect to be a leader and instead be a human leader that people actually find inspirational then, because they can connect themselves to you and see themselves in you, which is much more motivating.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you do in the book is offer some exercises that people can do about things like, how might I show up and be more authentic and open and express vulnerability? And maybe leaders who are not used to doing that, who find it to be a little scary or they're not quite sure where to start, can follow your advice about how to actually do that and put that into practice. I mean, plenty of people out there probably are already doing this to a degree, but I imagine that for some people, this is a pretty big shift from where they're starting.
Yeah, definitely. I think some people are coming into work with that I'm a perfect stoic leader face still, and they're not fully kind of embracing the vulnerability side of things. And to your point, people are starting in different places. So we have all these worksheets in the book because we want people to practice these things. But if you're great at something, go to the next worksheet, right? But hopefully there's a lot that you can learn throughout all the different behaviors. And some places you'll be strong, some places you won't be. So focusing in on where you can do better, I think, is really crucial. And for the vulnerability piece, we introduce a concept of a struggle statement. And that's really just helping you communicate challenges or difficulties that you've faced in your career, both past and present. So things that you've, struggled with in the past, maybe you've overcome it, things that maybe you're currently struggling with. And just doing the activity of writing it down, like, here are things I struggle with. So then you have something to go to, and maybe starting with something that's really like an easy struggle where you're not super embarrassed about. And then ones that get more complex, a little bit harder to share. So then you can think about times when it might be appropriate to share that situation, your statement with somebody. Maybe an employee is struggling with something and you can commiserate together, or as you're launching like a new project and there are some potential roadblocks, you can talk about things you faced in the past, or even just asking for help from your employees, right? Like sometimes your employees can be better at something than you are. And it's okay to be vulnerable and just say like, hey, I'm terrible at budgets. Like, do you want to help me on this budgeting exercise? And maybe we can work on it together. And that way you're showing that you're not perfect, which is totally fine. And then that person is getting to know you a little bit better, but they're also now getting a cool opportunity. So there's a lot of ways you can use these struggle statements to make your relationships more meaningful and also to help show your true self to your employees.
Yeah, and this didn't make it into the book, but there's a woman who is just absolutely stellarly successful in academia in the field of psychology. Her name's Mickey Hebel. She's published like hundreds and hundreds of articles and a book. She won a national teaching award where they only pick one educator from the entire country. And she won. She's run a marathon on every continent and in every state, I think. I mean, she's like just an achiever. And she, several years ago, one of her students said, I really appreciate the opportunity to learn from you, but, everything you touch kind of turns to gold. And it's hard to, learn from somebody who's just like, they're just hitting constantly success. And that made her realize that people are only seeing the things that worked and not the things that didn't work. So she created an anti-resume, which is all the stuff she tried for that she didn't get. Every grant she applied for that got rejected. Every paper that she tried to publish that got rejected. Every job she applied for that she didn't get. And she gives that to her students in their first year when they come to work with her. Like, it's not that I didn't face rejection. It's just that I turned it around fast and went somewhere else. Like, it's more about persistence than it is about never failing. And I've heard from her students that it just means so much to see this long list of failures next to a long list of successes, makes it much more likely that they're going to feel motivated to try to follow in her footsteps too.
Yes, I love that. Instead of this perfect kind of grandiose person, you see the struggle behind it. One of the professors I had at Harvard talked about hanging up rejection letters. I think it was like in their bathroom or something like that. And even just telling that story, you see a Harvard professor, you think, oh, they're so successful, and you forget they've been rejected a million times for jobs and papers and schools. And it's so humanizing.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we were saying before, motivating, because what her student was really saying to her was like, I can't be you, so I'm just not going to try to be
Why
you.
bother?
And I think, the point that she made and made it well, it's not just the highlight reel, right? Which is a lot of what we see about people's lives is just the highlight reel. Social media is a highlight reel for the most part. And so we need to get out of that idea that we have to look perfect and always coiffed and ready, and that we can be a little messy.
Yes. The messiness is relatable.
Yes.
Yeah. So in my book on burnout, I wrote a lot about the importance of workplace culture and sort of healthy teams as a protective factor for burnout. And I think you wrote about that too. So it was kind of cool to see those come together. And you have a chapter about setting the tone, where leaders can help to create that really healthy team and workplace culture. How would you describe the type of team culture that people might be wanting to foster, and what can leaders do to help get there?
It's a great question. So I think in terms of the descriptors, flexibility is a key one, right? Authenticity we already talked about, but it's authentic relationships, not just, with the leader and the team member that they are working with, their employees, but the employees within themselves. So the leader can really drive authentic connection within the team by doing that themselves, right? Showing how it's done, setting that example. So we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that leaders, they set that tone, right? They set the example of what is expected on the team based on their own behaviors, not just what they say, but their own actions. So being able to be flexible with their own schedules so they can manage their own work and life, show flexibility for other people's schedules, allow them to do what they need to do. Understanding that what that works for them doesn't work for everybody else. So like being really honest about that and transparent about what works for them and how like something else doesn't work for what they need, but being able to see that other people's perspectives matter as well. They really do a good job of protecting people's boundaries. So showing that. But then I think when you get to the depth of it, it's about a culture where people are collaborative, there's positivity, and they're really helping each other out. They're showing gratitude. And that's really contagious. So if a leader is able to be positive with their team, and it's not like fake positivity or toxic positivity where everything is rosy, right? We've already talked about it. It's okay to have struggles, but generally having more of a positive perspective and being able to like see the learning and the challenges, doing that can help inspire team members to also bring that type of positivity to light. Same with gratitude. If they're able to share their gratitude with their team members, that's contagious. They start to thank folks, thank them publicly. The team members will follow suit and they'll start to share gratitude with each other. And that kind of creates this cycle and this environment where people are grateful for each other. That makes them more likely to help each other. It also is a great mechanism to show like what you value, right? So when somebody has to step out because their dog needs to go to the vet and a team member steps in to, run a meeting that they were supposed to meet, you show gratitude for that behavior. Other team members see that and they're like, oh, this is something that is valued by my leader. So I'm going to do that too. I'm going to step up when that happens next time. And so it kind of creates this spiral of great feelings and connection and collaboration that then team members continue to practice these things, even if you're not actively there all the time, right? So you're setting a tone where people know what the right behaviors are because of the way you act and the way you behave that they then embody regardless of whether you're on vacation or, in meetings all day and so aren't able to be interacting with them all the time.
I also want to take a slight deeper dive into this idea of toxic positivity, because this is something that's come up a couple of times in our conversations with people who have read the book and thinking through, what does it really mean to have a positive emotional culture? And I think that's really the key term. It's not that you always have to be positive. It's that you have to have a positive emotion culture, which means that you can't have a positive culture if everybody's suppressing all the bad stuff. And so it's not that you're always like, rah, rah, everything's great. It's the most perfect day in the world. And it's this idea that, yes, you have more positivity in the team than negativity, right? On balance, as Patricia was saying. But you can't have a really good positive culture if you're only getting there by forcing people not to share stuff that they're actually struggling with and negative feelings. So it's more like having an emotion culture that has positive features, which does lend itself to being a more positively charged tone of the team on balance. But that also means that people are not hiding negative emotions, because then it makes the positive emotions false and like on a shaky foundation. So that's part of it too. We all know people who are just cheerleaders when it doesn't make sense because they're not willing to face the realities of having a tough conversation. And that's not what a positive culture is.
No, that's very off-putting, because what people really want is like openness and validation and not rah-rah cheerleading, even when things are hard. Yeah, Such a good point.
Yeah, it's acknowledging the hard things, but not dwelling on them constantly.
Yeah, not getting stuck there. And that's all that's happening, right? Well, Patricia, you mentioned something I want to return to, which is about flexibility and also kind of that person-centered idea, person-centered planning, you call it in the book. Sometimes different employees have different styles or they need different things. And so maybe we could just talk a little bit more about that, about this idea of, how do you kind of adapt to the different needs of people on the team?
Yeah, I mean, we do talk a lot about how one size doesn't fit all. And I know I mentioned already that leaders that are flexible but know that their way isn't the right way is so important. So let's say you're looking at 4 CHROs. They all got there in different ways, right? And being very narrow in your thinking and understanding that like this is how you get somewhere is the way I did it, the way that I like to do it. That's the way. Doesn't help anybody, right? Because everybody's different. Everyone has their own unique preferences. We talk a lot about like different preferences and how people work. And in order for a leader to do this effectively, they need to be able to set aside their own biases, their own preferences, and really hear what other people need. So they've built authentic relationships. They really are having open dialogues. And in that, they need to be really trying to understand like the honest response. Like, what is the honest thing that's going on with that person? They need to suspend all of their judgment and they need to show empathy. It's not about leaders having a solution for every single problem and every single employee's nuances and preferences, but being kind of that sounding board and working through it together is so important, because the employee probably will come up to a solution that makes sense for them. And then you work on it and workshop it together. You don't know what's best for them. So you can give them ideas, but you're taking a seat back really and letting the employee drive the solutions for whatever wellness challenges they're facing is so critical for that kind of one size doesn't fit all approach, if you will.
Yeah. And I think something that we talk about, there's a chapter in the book on kind of challenges and backlash that generators might face. And one of the things that came up early on when we were socializing these ideas for the book with some colleagues was, well, what if I'm trying to honor someone's needs, but that conflicts with someone else's needs, right? So let's say half my team wants to work remotely and the other half wants to work in person. How do I figure that out? And one of the things that we talk about is that you're not going to be able to perfectly balance all of these things, right? So maybe there are certain decisions that have to be made where somebody's not going to be happy with that decision, but somebody else will be. But where you can to make those tailoring moves, right? So that people understand and you've banked some goodwill and intentionality that, when this leader can do these things, they look out for me. They tailor things to what I need. So it's not that every single thing has to be tailored to each individual person. That's not possible. But if they know that your general orientation is to try to make things work and try to get solutions that will work for the individual, you buy yourself some grace in situations where you can't. And then also just explaining that. So there's a story in the book where a woman really wanted to relocate to California. And originally she had made this request to one boss and the boss just says, no, sorry, can't do it. We've never done that before. Not going to happen. And then she asked another person when she got a new leader, the same question. And that person came to the same conclusion that they were unable to actually move her, but talked her through the process and tried to push back on, unreasonable reasons why, and didn't just say, no, we've never done that before. And so even though the outcome was the same, the process of getting to that answer was different. And that meant something to her. And that's why she relayed that story to us, was like, yeah, it was the same answer, but I put so much more faith and trust in the second leader because she tried. And when she couldn't, she explained to me why, and it made sense, and said that she would revisit that at another time period if there was something that changed about the reason why she couldn't. So there's also like the way it gets delivered matters, not just like shutting people down.
Yes. And that actually relates to something else in your book, which is about sometimes being a little counterculture if the workplace culture isn't good for people, and maybe even sometimes breaking a few rules or at least stretching the rules a little bit, because I think that's something leaders sometimes are able to do, which is if there's a rule that's unreasonable, they might be the best person to go around it or, to kind of empower employees. So I love that. Can you maybe say a little something about this? It made me kind of excited, like a little mischievous excitement arose.
Yeah. So there is this concept of microcultures, right? Like teams, leaders can create microcultures that are maybe a little different than the rest of the culture outside the organization. And with that can come kind of figuring out what makes sense within the team. And if you have a lot of trust on your team, breaking a rule stays within the team, right? That's not like you're going to have a team member go and say something or create potential drama from it, because your team has this now really great collaborative microculture that you can bend rules and adjust as you need to. Like I worked in an organization, for example, that when you took any appointment or anything, you had to log that time off. Do you think my team did that? No, we never did that. And that's because our leader was like, that's silly. Like, just take off a couple hours. Like, you're not hourly. It's not like we have to log your time. So go do that. Go what you need to do and come back and whatever. So like those kinds of things those policies are in place for a reason, maybe. But it's not really doing any harm to break and stretch those rules a little bit. So I think as a leader, you have some power. You know where you can and can't stretch the rules. You get to know kind of the way the organization functions and when something might be appropriate to adjust. And I think you just take it, right? You do what you can to make that culture what you need it to be and to add the flexibility that you need your team to have, and support them. And honestly, like your engagement scores and all those things, your retention numbers will support you if it ever comes back to you. You'll have some information to be like, hey, like, yes, I did this one thing, but like it really helped us meet this goal for this project because people were not burnt out or people were able to take care of themselves or whatever that looked like, right? So I think that as a leader, you can figure out what that risk level is. And to Katina's point, when it's something is too risky, where like they're cracking down on something, let's say, then you can just explain that that's the case and people will still trust you and your microculture can still thrive, even if you can't always bend the rules the way it makes sense.
Yeah. And a lot of what we uncovered with the leaders that folks told us about was this very humane approach, right? And sometimes these blanket rules that organizations have don't allow for people to deal with these situations in a humane way. So we have a story in the book about somebody who was grappling with his own personal health challenges, but also engaging in some elder care. And this was a more chronic state, right? So a leave didn't really make sense. This was more like a shift in the way that he was going to have to work. And so some leaders might have said, well, either you're in or you're out. If you're grappling with these health issues and it's going to be disruptive to the, hours that you're working on a more regular basis, then you need to take a leave because we can't deal with that. Instead, his leader said, let's figure out a way for the team to work around what you're doing. And so while technically he didn't get approval to change the work schedules for the people on his team and to set it up that way in the structure, and probably his workplace would have preferred him to make this person take a formal leave. That's not what made sense for this situation and would have had financial implications for this person. And so instead, they were able to just change the way this person was working, because when they went to HR to talk about a solution, the solution just didn't align with the problem. And so they found their own way of doing it. It wasn't illegal what he did, but it just wasn't what HR suggested that they do. And it ended up working out.
Yeah, I think this is important. We're not talking about cheating or fraud or doing unethical things. It's more like humane things when the rules are getting too rigid and they don't work with people's lives. You need to be a little late because you have to drop a kid off at school. We don't need to make a big, deal about that if it's not important to doing your job. And I actually think that's one of the things that when I think of one of the best leaders I had, which was Michael, maybe he'll listen to this, I don't know. He's kind of protected us a little bit in our humanity when there were all these things coming through all the time. And he would kind of filter them out and sometimes be like, this one's really important, you need to do this. And this one isn't as big of a priority. And it's nice to have someone you feel like is kind of looking out for you a little bit. In those kinds of ways. It just feels like they care about you and it makes you feel motivated to do good work.
Exactly. Like we were talking about earlier, the employees want to do good work for a leader like that because that leader cares. So we need to make sure that leader looks good too, because we want them here. We want to, we want this team to continue in this way. So they're going to pay the leader back by really committing and doing the great work. And we talk a little bit about like boundary bouncing, right? So having leaders that can really support boundaries and like push away people and projects and things that are trying to encroach on your boundaries as an employee. And that like protection that a leader provides is so crucial. It can have a little bit of a tax on the leader, right? So leader recovery, all of that is really important, which we talk about like the challenges section, like how do you recover after being that kind of a leader? But when you have a leader that really tries to protect you, like even they might be honest and tell you like, these are the things that are happening in the organization broadly, but we're not going to do that. We're going to do this and this and this. You've got transparency. They understand the climate the organization they're in. And then they're also knowing that like they can trust you and count on you to support them and have their back, even if things go south.
And having someone who you can ask for permission to say no, and they support you in saying no. So, a lot of opportunities come my way in terms of like academics get asked to do a lot of things in journals and stuff that's unpaid and committee work and things like that. And so if you just get used to this idea of you have to say yes all the time, you get so overwhelmed with things. And so in my department right now, I can ask and say, my inclination is that I really don't want to do this and I want to say no to this. Is that okay? And having, people in the department that will say, yes, say no to that. Your inclination is correct. You shouldn't be taking that on. And also, if you want me to help you say no to that, I'm happy to take the fall on it. So if you can say, your chair said that you have XYZ on your plate already and taking on ABC is not going to work at this time. And that's also really nice because you have options and you feel like you're supported in being able to turn things down, even if they might be a good opportunity because you just have too many things on your plate.
Oh, that's huge. Yeah, to have someone. And I love the bouncer metaphor. In my burnout book, I write about boundary setting, but if you don't have that person who's going to help you and protect you, it's much harder. you picture this person standing at the door, like, help them in.
Real big, like serious
guarding the door
looking.
for you.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up here, because I could probably talk to you two all day, I'm not kidding, but I do want to talk a little bit about overwork and the culture of overwork, which you talk about throughout your book. I think it is such a problem here in America and definitely other places around the world where it's almost the expectation, the norm, and it's a challenging problem because I think sometimes people are very resistant to not overworking. People and also, executives. And it's definitely something I see a lot in my clients where it's almost the expectation. What's the problem with overwork and how can leaders move the needle on this?
This goes back to, and I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record on this, but these ideal worker norms, part of them is being always on, right? There's nothing distracting you from being productive in the workspace. And so we've sort of adopted this idea. And, when it was harder to reach people outside of work, people had an easier time disconnecting. Now there's no area, like an out of office message feels funny now, right? Because like, what is office? It's like your phone, so the idea of, being unreachable sort of went out the window. And people sort of adapted to that because that was the expectation. And so now the idea that you're always on and you're sending emails late at night and early in the morning is just part of what's put on you as an employee in many contexts. What it really takes is a leader to recognize that that's a very short-term game. The long-term game is to allow people time to disconnect from work at the end of the day, to allow people time to disconnect from work on the weekends and during vacation. And the thing that's wild to us that we keep hearing is, so many people in leadership roles are like, this is so horrible. I have to take conference calls on vacation and all these sort of things. But then, okay, are you bugging your team members on vacation? Well, yeah, I am bugging them on vacation. Okay, so you're part of your own problem because you're upset people are doing it to you, but you're doing it to other people. So it really takes the leader to stop and say, what kind of a team culture do we want? And what responsibility do I have to role model that and set those behaviors? So we talk about scheduling emails, making sure that they're not coming in off hours. So if it works for you to get your work done late at night, that's fine, but don't make it someone else's problem that they're getting pinged at 11:30 p.m. And they're seeing their leaders working and now they feel like they have to respond. So scheduling emails, resisting the urge to contact people when they've taken PTO or they've asked for an afternoon off or whatever the case may be, just leave them alone, setting those norms, and also keeping other people from bothering people when they're out. So if you notice that there's a team member who's doing that, to side message that person and say, this person's out and it's not really appropriate to be contacting them. Next time around, why don't you take them off? And then replying to that email and saying, I know that you're out, so don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. So these little messages that people send to help folks disconnect can help people to actually give permission to release themselves from this norm and expectation because they realize you can still be successful and not have to continue running yourself ragged.
And I think it's important for the leader to not respond to messages either, right? You get the messages, just don't respond. Even if you feel like, oh, I have the answer. Oh, well, don't respond so they know that it's okay to not respond. And the thing I'll add to this too is this idea of the vital few, right? We tend to put so much on our plates. What actually matters? Like I've had great leaders that's what they focus on is like, let's look back. These are our goals that we set for the year. Do we need to do all of these things? What actually needs to happen? What is critical and what is less critical? And what does our capacity look like? And is this a time when, is it over the holidays and a lot of people are taking time off? Why are we putting so many goals on our plate, right? So being able to really think through like what is truly crucial and focusing on those things. And then if something pops up that that maybe you need to address, making sure you reprioritize. And as a leader that, reports to other leaders, having those conversations with your leader consistently, showing a plan, having a built out document that like, here are the things that we're working on, and this is the capacity that we're at, and making sure you have, whether your leader is good or not, like a secret or not secret cushion for illness and vacations and all that stuff, so that people understand like we're at capacity. And if you're really, really disciplined on that and keeping your focus on the few things that matter the most, it can go a long way in making the team feel focused, have them work towards specific goals, and also know like it's okay if something comes in that's just not important to not do it. Push it off to something a different time, right? And have that leader there to say no for you too if you need it.
That's a wonderful note to end on. I mean, especially if resources are low, time, staffing, if there's concern about finances, it's really important to be very clear about the important stuff and to have that ability to prioritize so that the important stuff gets done, but people aren't so ragged. I love that. Well, there's so much more we could talk about. So I hope people will pick up the book because it's very inspiring and there's a lot more where this came from in terms of things that you can do. And where can people find you online? I know you have your terrific podcast and you have a lot of resources available for people.
Yeah, you can find us at workerbeing.com, WORKRBEEING. You'll find links to we have articles on Psychology Today. We have links there. We have our podcast up there. And we also have links to our book on workerbeing.com/book. That's probably the best place to get information. But also Katina and I are super active on LinkedIn. So if you find us on LinkedIn, we're always posting about new research, new things that we're doing. So that's a great place to find us too.
Fabulous. We'll link to all of that in our show notes for today. And thank you so much for coming on the show. It was really fun to talk to you too. I love thinking about some of the things I think about in my burnout book but from this slightly different vantage point. It's really fun to talk to you.
Yeah, fun to talk to you too. You asked great questions and we really enjoyed the conversation.
Always fun to be with someone like-minded.
Yes.
Right. That's right. We have a lot in common, so we better stay in touch.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we just listened to this conversation on leading for wellness, and I'm here with Jill to have a little co-host discussion of the episode. Jill, where should we start? There's so much to talk about with this one.
Oh my gosh, there is so much to talk about. I have not taken this many notes on an episode in quite a long time. And I loved everything they had to say. It gave me a lot of hope. I think we've long suspected that older models of leadership and workplace health probably aren't working anymore. And I love that what they brought is the science and this discussion of how important it is that we show up to the workplace as whole humans, human beings who have lives outside of work, human beings who have struggles and feelings, humans who show up with honesty and authenticity and vulnerability, and that ultimately it's our humanness, like not our go, do, be a Western capitalist, that actually is not just best for the people, but it's what's actually best for the organization.
Yes. It's better for all levels, the organization, the leaders themselves, and the people being led. And I think this reminds me of the conversation I had with Carla McLaren about emotions in the workplace, which was a couple years ago. And just this idea of we need to bring our whole humanity. We're not going to turn into robots when we walk in the door at work. But sometimes it feels like that's kind of the expectation.
Yes, organizations and systems take a long time to change. And a lot of the original workplace modeling is based on a patriarchal society where all couples are heterosexual and all men go out and work and make the money and all women stay home and raise children and do domestic things. And maybe that worked when that was the primary setup, but it certainly does not work anymore. And actually, I question whether it even really worked back then. So even then, there was a little bit more, I don't know, break, levity. They're going out and playing golf, that kind of thing, versus this just complete unhealthy productivity and profits over all things, including people.
Well, I want to give a little nod to Bill George, who created this model of leadership called authentic leadership, because at that time, there were all these corporate scandals and kind of this culture of corporate greed and this model of, the male CEO in a suit who's all about profits. And he has this model of coming into leadership in a more authentic and real way and open to feedback, being more vulnerable, creating closer connections with people by being real. And research 100% supports this. And of course, it's been researched and the model has been improved upon over the decades since. But it's interesting because I think it is pretty well known that this is a better model, and yet it is absolutely slow to change these stereotypes and just this thinking around leadership and how, what leadership should look like.
Right. And I also loved in this same vein when they were talking about that old model of the ideal worker not really being apt anymore, and that we need to be more honest about the reality of our lives, and that leaders need to reflect this both in terms of, setting expectations. But the other thing that this does is it creates better bonds. And I thought, well, duh, like how many episodes have we done that it always ends up coming back around to relationships? And, of course, we've got 8 decades of research that tell us how important bonds and relationships are too. And so, of course, doesn't it make sense that when we're talking about authenticity, honesty, vulnerability, being open to feedback, talking about our mistakes and struggles, that what does all that do between humans? It bonds them. Of course, there need to be certain levels of boundaries, most likely in certain kinds of professional relationships, and that's okay. But that those, having a strong bond really matters in terms of the quality of what's happening in the workplace.
Yeah. And it always comes back to that on this podcast, doesn't it? That it's about relationship and connections. And when I think about my own career and different work situations I've been in over the years, having a solid team, having people that I care about at work, having good relationships is one of the most essential things to times when I feel happy and satisfied at work versus times when I'm exhausted, stressed, burnt out. And so, it all goes back to that. Well, thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation today, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.